As I read this little lesson, again, my co-host may ask me to pause to give commentary on how this affects us today and separate that actual history from the fuzzy mythology we learned in our social studies classes, Mr. Hobson's social studies class for me in junior high. Now, I do have sources for this material, which I will post in the show notes and on the podcast audio apps later. So many Americans today hear about slavery and think to themselves, that was so long ago. They got let go and Lincoln is a hero, or the South was actually fighting for taxation and representation, states' rights. In 2011, a Pew Research poll found that Americans were significantly divided on the issue, with 48% saying the Civil War was mainly about states' rights, 38% saying it was mainly about slavery, and the remainder either answering equally or that they did not know. So slavery in the United States lasted from our conversation last week about colonization in 1619 all the way up to 1865. That 2.5 century period is of massive importance to America, and not just because it led to a civil war, but because we still struggle with this legacy today. The slave-based economy in the South was a product of the mid-1800s market revolution. Now, since 3/4 of the world's cotton came from the American South. However, this cotton was industrially manufactured in the North. Despite the fact that the northern states mostly outlawed slavery, the production and sale of cotton textiles overseas made northern merchants very rich. Seeing this, northern bankers, of course, aggressively financed purchases of land, and plantations gave them with sweetheart deals, and northern insurance companies insured slaves who were, of course, considered very valuable property. Now, most slave states were home to a couple of cities. For example, Mikey's home of St. Louis, Baltimore, and New Orleans were cities. But for the most part, the South was overwhelmingly a rural area. Now, this meant that Southerners who had been granted that free land by headright acts or who purchased the land themselves left almost no room for any other industry because, of course, greed. But with the exception of the cotton gin, the Industrial Revolution more or less passed by the South. Most notably, their desire to put free labor to work on as much free land as possible led to the lack of building too many railroads. Now, this meant that slavery shaped the South both economically and culturally. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the U.S., and in the South, they made up 1/3 of the total population. In fact, during the writing of the Constitution, there was a great compromise, as they called it, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a person. Now, that's because the South wanted each slave to count as a full constituent, meaning, of course, more Congress people, while the North said that by the South's own definition, they were not people, so they should count for 0. Now, it's true that most white people in the South did not own slaves at all. Sidebar, see, I knew slavery wasn't as bad as people say. Now, these yeoman farmers were mostly poor, but supported slavery in part because, 1, they would often rent slaves, 2, aspirational reasons, 3, because even the poorest whites were afforded legal and social status above them. In fact, Southern intellectuals encouraged the idea of something called white solidarity. So sidebar number 2, it's not better. It's actually way fucking worse. And that's not even the half of it. Our nation's founders saw slavery as what they would call a necessary evil. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go." Then goes on to imply that the injustices of slave owning were outweighed by the idea of self-preservation. Now, as abolitionist ideas started to spread, Southerners began to make the astonishing and still hanging around case that slavery lifted the Negro up. Because, of course, masters fed, clothed, and even took care of them in their old age, allowing slave owners to frame themselves as benevolent. That narrative that slavery was a social good was best stated in 1837 by a wonderful guy named John C. Calhoun. Quote, I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. And this, of course, was so unpopular that it destroyed Calhoun's career. Actually, I'm lying. He was later named Secretary of State and then elected Vice President. But that's it, right? Wrong. Weiss justified this insanity with out of context biblical passages, examples of Greek and Roman slaves, and Aristotle building those cultures, and with early eugenic arguments claiming that black people were inherently inferior and that freeing them would upset the natural order and ultimately destroy the Negro. Now, dehumanization wasn't just a cultural system, it was literally written into law. Beatings, brandings, and rape were intentional because in order for slavery to function, slaves had to be dehumanized. They had to break the spirit and reduce slaves to livestock status, a concept known as chattel slavery. But if you think it gets better here, again, sadly, you are wrong. One thing slaves did to keep their humanity was to form families. Black slaves married, despite efforts to prohibit it, and formed families, which of course empowered slaves, so that had to go. In fact, it's recorded that up to 35% of slave families were broken up by selling the father or the children, meaning that, and adding natural death to the mix, nearly half of slave families were single-parent homes. Religion was also an important part of life in slavery, and despite most masters giving out slave Bibles, including, of course, only the parts of the Bible that they wanted them to know, instead, stories of Exodus, where Moses brought slaves out of bondage, or biblical heroes who overcame odds, were very popular. Most slaves were forbidden to read or write, but many did anyway, and some became preachers who were important but dangerous to owners because it was preachers who often led escape efforts and revolts. And I'll circle back to that in a bit. Big Haas, Mikey, well, this is about the 1/3 point, so any thoughts at this point so far?
The pronunciation is chattel slavery.
Is that what I said?
You said
what did I
chattel.
say? Chattel? Chattel? Isn't that a brand of toys? Chattel?
No, that's Mattel. Yeah, I would encourage people to look up and read about the concept of buck breaking as a method of breaking the spirit of newly acquired slaves. Buck breaking and was one of the very popular, especially in the Central and South America, for breaking the spirit to quash rebellions and things of that nature. It was a system where the masters would take, and you see how emotional I'm getting about talking about this right now because I'm patting the bar here. They would take the biggest, strongest, most rebellious slave and strap him down on his stomach, and the master would rape him over and over again in front of the rest of the slaves. So that's one of the legacies of slavery that I believe leads to the extreme anti-LGBT sentiment in the black community. I mean, if you think that sentiment is bad here in America, you should see how it is in Haiti and Jamaica and places like that, because that's where it was chiefly used, that method of quashing the spirit of slaves and making them more subservient. Because the theory was, if you show them what you can do to their biggest, strongest person, then the rest will just fall in line. And that's just one of the atrocities that came out of slavery.
Go watch Roots if you haven't seen it.
All right. So It just touching on what you said there was a story that I was reading, and I left out a lot of the individual stories, obviously, because we don't want this to go hours. But I read one story about how a particular slave had woke up in the morning with his kids, and the child documented how the master came up and said, "Hey, I'm going to beat you today." And the slave replied, "Well, why? I haven't done anything." He said, "That's exactly why I'm going to beat you, so you don't do anything." So of course that slave later killed that master with a hoe, but that's something that we'll get down to in a bit here. So next we're going to talk about the Mexican-American War. Now, you might ask me, why is that important? Well, here's the answer. After the Mexican-American War, Texas became a state, but they wanted to become a slave state. And the U.S. government, afraid southern states would have too much power, also gave statehood to Oregon. Now, the statehood of Texas meant that thousands of Catholics, Mexicans, and Native Americans suddenly became U.S. citizens under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now, this led to negative reactions, of course, from a new group called nativists. Now, if you guys haven't heard of this, you're going to love it. They're also known sometimes as nationalists, who viewed these groups, the Mexicans, the Native Americans, and the Catholics, as inferior. In fact, this led to a new political party called the American Party, dedicated entirely to such anti-immigrant sentiment. American Party members were referred to as know-nothings because when you asked them about policy, they knew nothing, nonetheless. And shockingly, not unlike today, they did pretty damn good. Those damn culture wars. So this is very important to American slavery because, like Texas, a slave state was added to the nation whenever a free state was added, and not always in accordance with the Missouri Compromise, which was supposed to outlaw any slaves over the 3630 or Mason-Dixon line, whatever you want to call it. But in California, there were not enough white American residents to apply for statehood until, of course, gold was discovered in 1948, which somehow led to the naming of the NFL franchise the 49ers. But
it took them a while to get there.
But whatever. Which somehow led but the gold rush increased the white population in California, thankfully so, to the necessary amount, a phenomenon that continues to reward us today with the likes of Dianne Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi. The California Constitution of 1850 limited civil participation to whites. This meant that the 25,000 Chinese who migrated there to work for the rail and mining companies, the Native Americans who lived there for centuries.
1848, not 1948.
Did I say 19? Thank you for correcting me. In 1950.
Divine Displeasure was right.
Right. The Constitution of 1850. The Native Americans who lived there for centuries and the free blacks, who none of these people could vote or testify in court. But the big issue to slavery ended up being conflicts with Indians over land that had gold. These conflicts reduced the native population by 75% and led to many orphaned Indian children. Why does this matter to slavery, Dutch?
Native.
Well, yes, in the context of the Native Americans, but from the source I took it from, this is what they called them. So I'm trying to stay true to that source.
Fuck that source.
So this led to many orphaned Native American children. Now, so in the spirit of Christian charity, these kids were sold as slaves. Now, what this meant was there was a conflict about whether or not California should have been a slave state or free state. And the Missouri Compromise was of zero help here because half of the Golden State is below the line and half of it is above the line. Enter the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state, but added 3 fucking horrible caveats. 1, they outlawed the slave trade, but allowed slave ownership. It imposed harsher fugitive slave. Also, number 2, they imposed harsher fugitive slave laws, requiring citizens to turn in anyone they knew to be a slave to authorities. This fucking terrified blacks in the North, because if even one person said you were a slave, guess what you were returned to? Slavery, even if you hadn't come from there in the first place. Hence, many blacks fled to Canada. Last, number 3, was the incredibly innovative and evil idea of popular sovereignty, which stated that in the remaining territories taken from Mexico, the local white inhabitants could decide for themselves whether to own slaves, nullifying the Missouri Compromise entirely. And that brings us to wonder. Now, what, I wonder, was the Supreme Court up to around this time? Well, they were in the process of handing down perhaps the worst decision in its history, Dred Scott. So Dred Scott had been a slave whose master had taken him to live in Illinois. Slavery was illegal in Illinois. So Scott sued, arguing that since slavery was illegal in Illinois, then living there made him not a slave. In 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney handed down his decision, holding that not only was Scott still a slave, but further ruled that since, and this is a quote from the Supreme Court, quote, since black people have for more than a century been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they have no rights to which the white man is bound to respect. Therefore, he is justly and lawfully to be reduced to slavery, and for his own benefit. What the actual fuck? Big Hoss, Dred Scott.
America going to America when America want to America, man. Come on, man. They you know, here's the thing. When you got people in the system who arguably help make the system, who do you think they're gonna try to upset the system? Think about what happens if they say, okay, guess what? You know, he is free because it's illegal there or whatever, and he now deserves rights and privileges. Come on. That's a dangerous precedent to set. They are not going to make that. You know what I mean? Ooh, excuse me. Just popped out.
I was just kind of waiting for Mikey to chime in. I'm sure he's saving all of his love for the end.
America, what a great fucking place to be from. Yeah.
So the Compromise of 1850 and the Dred Scott ruling meant that technically there was no such thing as a free state. Mm-hmm. And it helped to lead to the creation of the Republican Party. In 1860, Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln as a candidate. Lincoln was an abolitionist, but he said that he was fine leaving slavery, the status quo, where it existed for the good of the Union. Nonetheless, the South wanted no parts of Lincoln. Now listen to this. And this was proven by the fact that he literally received 0 votes in 9 states. Remember we heard that Obama got 0 vote or won 100% of the vote in Philadelphia a couple years ago, and therefore it must be fraud. History is a bitch.
Here's what's funny too. It seems to be that a lot of non-slave owning white people that could still voted. They didn't, you know. So when you say my family didn't own slaves, but you were sure damn comfortable, you know what I mean? You're sure adjacent.
Yeah, and that was what we kind of talked about before. Even the poorer whites who didn't own slaves still benefited from the social order and aspired to own slavery, or own slaves, I should say. So, and as I said, they would rent them from time to time. So so Abraham Lincoln again received 0 votes in 9 states, but Lincoln did win the Electoral College. Now, before he even took office, the Confederacy was born, with each of the states drafting articles of secession, and all of which mentioned protecting the institution of slavery as a key component to the decision to leave the Union. Lincoln officially emancipated the slaves 3 years later. Now, as noted earlier, the road to the Civil War leads to arguments about states' rights to slavery, differing economic systems regarding the use of slaves, and the election of abolitionist Abraham Lincoln. Clear observation here from me. None of those things would have even been needed to be discussed or would have been issues without slavery. So can we please, for once, close the case on there being other reasons for the Civil War?
Never.
But this story is not without its heroes. So a bit ago, we mentioned slaves escaping with the help of charismatic leaders. And the most famous of these is Harriet Tubman, who at age 29 fled to Philadelphia, but made about 24 trips back to Maryland and possibly Virginia to help others escape via the Underground Railroad. And then there was armed rebellion. Now, slave uprisings were very rare, but some of the most famous ones were Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800 and 1811 uprising, where a group of slaves armed themselves and marched on New Orleans before militia stopped them. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a former slave, was executed for a plot to destroy Charleston, although it's fair to admit that there wasn't really any evidence. And of course, the trial probably was not fair. The most well-known revolt, though, was led by a charismatic preacher named Nat Turner, who in 1831 led 80 slaves in slaughtering families on many small Virginia plantations. Turner and his men were executed for this, but not before they struck terror into the hearts of Southern whites and led to even worse characterization of all blacks as inherently violent animals. While slaughter on its face may be awful, it's hugely important to emphasize that Turner was revolting against the dehumanization that I've been talking about for the last 13 minutes. Slaves fought this oppression, at times taking up arms, at times learning and empowering themselves, at times escaping, but always refusing to be broken down by the cultural and systemic efforts to dehumanize them. That is what I call a powerful resistance. And in the end, it was their resistance, not Lincoln, who won their freedom. The end.
Nice.
And
here we go. Anyway,
I also
not going to acknowledge that.
Well, I also had a conversation with someone today that I didn't add to this, but they had. I was looking at some of. Well, okay. First of all, divine disbelief. I left out John Brown, but this isn't about the white people. This is about
right.
So
can we have something?
Yeah. So, but I will say, John Brown. If you want to find a white hero of slavery, it's not Lincoln. It's John Brown. Right. John Brown was probably a very shitty leader, but this is a guy who robbed a federal artillery compound and tried to give the guns to slaves so that they could arm an uprising. He was executed for that. And basically when he was executed said, the only way that this country is going to be cleaned is by bloodshed. Go ahead.
That's Eminem's great grandfather. He was always hanging out with the brothers and he had that thing on him.
Did we lose Mikey there? Oh, we lost Mikey.
I hear him.
Okay.
You don't hear him?
No, I lost him for a second.
Oh, yeah.
I heard him say that was Eminem's grandfather.
Yeah.
Just so you know, I got that fire on me right now.
Got that thing on him.
Because you never know. That's what I tell my wife all the time.
John Brown was an abolitionist. Went on to some, just thoughts and prayers until it goes away. No, he's like, no, y'all finna stop this bullshit right now because I got a cannon that I stole from the government. What's good?
Yeah, I'm totally. I love the John Brown story, but again, we have way too many efforts to put in white saviors, and I'm not taking anything away from John Brown, but this is more about the cultural ideas that we still deal with today that come from slavery. And one of the things that someone said today on Facebook or on Twitter, I'm sorry, that I thought was interesting was they had defended slavery, saying that because they were so bad in Brazil and in other South American areas where slaves only lived to like 20 years old, that we were better than they were and that we gave them better opportunities. And I'm like, well, yeah, Southern slave owners probably treated them better than they did in South America because they wanted to have them breed so they could sell more slaves. You know, so it's like there's but these arguments still continue today.
Who you be talking to with these arguments? Don't talk to those people.
All you have to do is go on Twitter and type in the word slavery and you find these comments.
No, I'm good.
So
hard pass.
Hey, but just like Sweet Brown said, I ain't got no time for that.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
I'm trying to get me a pop.
Get you a pop. Okay, so there is our history lesson for today. Mikey, very quiet on this one. You just don't want to hear about it, or I mean, where's your head at?
I learned all this at 12, so this is nothing new, and I don't really have a whole bunch of.
I didn't give you even one new fact.
No, I'm quite astute. Like, and that's why I was like, all right, this is a segment. Do your segment. So I just sat back.
He got the best brain. He's a really smart guy.
Yeah.
He went to the best schools.
I'm like mad intelligent. So, I mean, right. America's history sucks. It's fucking garbage.
Is there anything you would like to add?
Glad it's over.
It's not over though. It's just evolved.
Yeah, that's kind of the point, I think.
It's just evolved. Like right now, think about it. Right now, the GOP is thinking of ways to institute regulations, laws, measures, whatever you want to call it, to further suppress the vote. Think about it also. Where was Trump trying to get votes thrown out? Right.
Georgia, where the
in certain counties of Georgia. You know,
but I mean, if we really want to talk about slavery, the prison industrial complex gives us nothing but a bevy. Nothing but a bevy of information to go from. So
because when Lincoln freed the slaves, he didn't necessarily free the slaves, and that's why within 3 years of the Emancipation Proclamation, the makeup of prisons flipped from 90% white to 95% black.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are something that I have on my docket. I don't know if I want to do them next week or not. I think I'd like to do something happier next week after having to suffer through writing this. But
let's do something less morose.
But that is something that we will discuss. The impact of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I mean, just the fact that we needed to have 2 more amendments after the 13th, just in and of itself, is a bit of an indictment. You know, you had instances where blacks would, started to get power in the South, and that terrified whites. And I think that there was the very last white black congressperson in the Congress as he left Congress was in Illinois. I forget the guy's name, but he gave his farewell speech, and I want to say 1901, and there was not another black person elected to Congress in Illinois even for like 75 more years. And across the country, it took until the 1980s, if I remember correctly, until you had another black African American in Congress.
You know something. We should also talk about the coup. I think it was in South Carolina or North Carolina, where they felt too many blacks had gotten elected during Reconstruction.
Right. And that's what I was referring to.
Literally marched on the Congress, the State House.
Yeah.
And threw those people out. He killed a bunch of people too, and there's they call it like the first coup in America or something like that. Very interesting because they just felt it was too many black people. And I think it's what led to, isn't that what led to, no, I'm wrong. Forget it. I'm wrong. I know I'm wrong.
Well, there's a lot. There's the story of why Reconstruction failed is itself a 16-minute conversation. You know what I mean? Because it's but every reason comes back to the same thing. You know, people fearing power, other groups having
losing power.
Yeah, people fearing losing power, and
I mean, and that goes from, like, it was the LBJ who said that if I could convince the lowest white man that he's better than a black man, he'll turn his pockets inside out for you. Something like, I'm paraphrasing, you know, and that sense, you know, because most of y'all know I'm from Chicago. I grew up on the low end, 44th and Stewart, and 6th grade was when I got bussed from. I was going to Hendricks on my side of town, and I got bussed under the bridge over to Alexander Graham. And quite soon after that, I got into it with a white student. And I'm now at 11 years old. I'm aware enough to know, dude, you guys use the same food stamps as us. So I said to him, you know, you're just as poor as I am, dude. Why do you think you're better than me? You know, or something to that effect. He's like, at least I'm not a. He's like, I might be poor, but at least I'm not a. And that, you know, like Chris Rock said, he's like, I'm rich, and there's not a white person in this room that would switch places with me right now.
Yeah. The the case that I make, like there's a reason why I think this conversation is important, because there's so much disinformation out there. And honestly, like, as a white kid growing up, I grew up in a neighborhood where there was probably 35% black kids in the neighborhood. So it was certainly a diverse area. Crete is where I grew up, for those who know the area. Now, of course, it's I think almost all black. I was born in South Holland, so named because it was a Dutch community. Big Haas, how many black people live in South Holland right now?
A lot, probably.
Or how many white people do you think live there?
Not very many now.
Yeah,
my ex-wife was lived in South Holland.
Oh, she did?
It used to be a sundown town. Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
South Holland.
It was. Go ahead.
Her stepfather was not very happy that she was dating me, especially when he realized that it was getting very serious between us. You know, it kind of was like, he thought he was not really taking it seriously and not really saying much about it until he realized that it was getting very serious. And then all of a sudden, you know, she was shocked to hear some of the stuff that he was saying. And I was like, I'm not shocked. You know, he realizes that this isn't just a fling or whatever. It's not like your previous boyfriends or whatever. So now here it comes. And South Holland, boy, yeah. Even when, and this was back in the mid 90s, you know, you still didn't want to get caught by the police, the South Holland police, if you was black after dark. You know what I mean? So you're definitely going to get pulled over. You're definitely going to get hassled if you're in the town of South Holland after dark. Yeah,
and I mean, obviously, we'll have another episode on white flight, but again, as a kid, you know, kind of circling back, as a kid growing up, like, my parents never instilled in me anything overtly racist, but they gave me the sort of the warning of, you know, be careful because there's a lot of Mexicans in West Chicago. Be careful that, you know, with some of the black kids, that sort of thing, you know, because sometimes they'll get into fights or whatever. And, you know, it's like, of course kids get into fights, you know, and like, I don't take that from my parents and say, well, my parents, you know, are overt racist. What I take from that is this, that white people, even the best meaning of them, especially when you get to the older generations, they have this idealistic American facade that, you know, they believe what they see on the news, you know, they believe the things that they hear. They don't have any real anecdotal experience with Black communities. I mean, my parents are an interesting case study because they have Black grandkids right now. They weren't happy, particularly when I was with the girl's mom. Now, as it turns out, in her particular case, she's a Class A piece of shit. But and I mean, like, she blows up every single stereotype of African Americans and takes them to the 21. But the point of the matter is, I dated other Black women too, and like, they never said don't. But you know, I kind of could feel that they were like, "Is he doing the right thing?" et cetera, et cetera. But we had Black people in our house. You know, we had people from the church, missionaries, Black missionaries who stayed with us from Africa and everything like that. So, you know, but then you hear other things that come up where it's like they tell you to be careful, that sort of thing. So you have to kind of juxtapose those two things together and say, how could someone who invites a Black family to live in our house for like a month still harbor distrust of the community, you know? And it's and I think that's an important question.
So
go ahead, Mikey.
But you said that was through the church, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry.
So
you said that was through the church, though, right?
They took in some missionaries from, I think it was Nigeria. I think.
Oh, they're from church. Oh, those are the good ones.
Those are the good ones.
So,
man.
well, these were Nigerian people, but yeah. So
those are the good.
Sure. Well, you could use that. You could use that as a justification. You know, I mean, that's not the only example, though. But I mean, we're
Black folks. Not
yeah,
those
and
out there.
I totally get that particular thing, because, you know, you have that he's a good one type of mentality. You know, we had other black kids stay in the house as foster parents who were, you know, in and out of our house all the time, Mexican kids, you know what I mean? And like, not ever one time did the race of that person come up. But the but
here's the thing with that too.
Go ahead.
Here's the thing with that too, is when you're taking in a foster kid, you're the adult, you're the authority figure, you have the power in that dynamic. And a lot of times when things come up is when that perceived dynamic is equal, when there's equal footing. You think about when Obama was president, there was a lot of people that just could not stand seeing him, a man with that much melanin, have that much power, because of the power dynamic. As long as there is a superior inferior dynamic where certain racist people are in the superior position, they have no problem, you know, with Black people around them, etc., as long as that power dynamic is there. It is when things equalize or when they don't feel that superiority. So then there becomes a problem.
So to bolster your case, when Angela Merkel became the president of Germany, prime minister of Germany, did American men flip out about it? Nope, because it didn't affect them. When all these Black women and men became presidents of their countries in Africa, did they care about it? Not at all. Oh, this fucking Obama guy.
Yeah.
Now I feel threatened. Now I feel inferior, because I still thought I was better than those people anyway. But now that I'm not better than this guy, and I should put my hand over my heart and salute this man, well, I ain't doing all that.
And then here's another thing is, that dude being elected to that position only makes those people more confident and more uppity.
Right.